Very good. We're looking at the relationship between quantitative data, quantitative analysis, and generating data for mission research. And our second speaker this week is John Gallacher. And John Gallacher is professor of cognitive health at the University of Oxford and director of the Dementias platform, UK, DPUK, an MRC-funded public-private partnership focused on accelerating research into the early detection and treatment of dementia. With a new diagnosis every 3 seconds and more than 50 million cases globally, dementia is one of the biggest public health challenges facing science and governments in the 21st century. An expert on brain health and the use of big data in medical research, Professor Gallacher holds a visiting professorship at Imperial College London and an honorary professorship at the University of Hong Kong. He is Principal Investigator for the Caerphilly Prospective Study, CAPS, and a member of the UK Biobank Strategic Oversight Committee. And so we look forward to hearing John speak and how this relates to mission. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. And I'm going to get the share screen up and then I'll get it over to you. Okay.
Well, Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for this kind invitation, and thank you for turning up. My job here really, I think, is to help you think differently. There is an apocryphal story about an English hardware firm, I think the name was Draper, who had recently refitted their factory to make it more efficient in terms of making drills. The problem was that they discovered after this investment that a German firm, possibly called Bosch, had refitted their factory and were able to produce drills at a much cheaper price. So they called in the management consultants. What should they do? And the management consultants turned up and they charged £300,000 for a complete review of the company, which didn't seem unreasonable. And the management consultants did what they do, and they went and watched what happened, talked to people, looked at different options, and then came back to the board with a report. And the chairman of the management company got up and said, well, I have 3 slides for you. And you can imagine the chairman of Draper thinking 3 slides, £300,000, £100,000 a slide. These slides better be good. So then he showed them the first slide. You told us you make drills. Well, you can understand this didn't receive a very warm reception. They knew this. But nevertheless, the chairman was known for his patience. So he's waiting for the next slide. You don't. By now, the chairman's getting a bit cross because he's just spent £200,000 on 2 PowerPoint slides. So he was completely unimpressed. So then the whole room was waiting for the 3rd slide. You make holes. And at that point, the penny dropped for the board. They must rethink their whole business plan into how can they efficiently make holes. And the answer is not in doing the same thing that they always used to do, just slightly more efficiently. The answer is taking a whole new perspective on what they really want to do. So what do you really want to do? What is your mission? And how are you going to achieve that? And it probably, in this day and age, it's probably not going to be by doing the same things that you've always done. Let's just try it, first of all, to understand our thinking, the way we think. What is knowledge? Well, without getting too philosophical about it, it's about the reduction of uncertainty. We live in a very big, complex world. It's very scary. And we like to be able to predict things, whether that's simply 2 plus 2 we know equals 4, or actually we know the sun is going to rise tomorrow. At least we're pretty hopeful it will. You know, I'd bet my mortgage on it rising tomorrow. So I think that's a fair amount of reduced uncertainty. And science really is the reduction of empirical uncertainty. How confident am I that the sun is actually going to rise in the morning at roughly 7:15? And the answer is, because of astronomy, etc., etc., I am very confident this is going to happen. But let's do a little thought experiment. Let's just imagine for a moment an omnipotent being who could do whatever he or she wanted. This omnipotent being just has to think something and it happens. And let's just develop this thought experiment and think, well, this omnipotent being is now going to write down every observation in the universe, every single one, every causal relationship, every thought. In doing that, there would be not one single objective value statement in the book. The book would be silent about what is right, what is wrong, what should happen, what shouldn't happen. The book will be full of people's thoughts on what should happen and what shouldn't happen. But in terms of an objective criterion, the observation from the complete and exhaustive observation of this universe would have no objective value statement. And the problem is that you cannot arrive at this objectivity from within the system. Let me give you an example. Can you tell me what this is?
It's a corner brace for a bookshelf.
Corner brace for a bookshelf. Any other offers from the room?
A cabinet.
A cabinet.
Sauna.
A sauna. Oh, that's exotic. That's exotic.
Can be anything.
It could be anything. And the point is, from within the box, you would not know. You just would not know. Actually, it's a wardrobe. And it might be a wardrobe with unusual characteristics. You might open the front door and discover you're in a bedroom. You might push through the fur coats at the back and discover you're in a completely magical world. The point is, from within the system, you cannot get a full description of everything that there is to do with that system. You only get that from outside of the system, looking in. So in terms of what is right, what is wrong, we can have guesses, we can have well-intentioned guesses, we can be tolerant of one another, we can be willing to have fundamentally different opinions, but nevertheless, from within the system, we cannot know. So what we have in science is what you might describe as an epistemological toolbox. Observation tells us what we can see. We're measuring effects. But how it happens, the causal model that underlines how it happens, well, we are inferring it. So, for example, I cannot prove to you that if A hits B, A has caused B. I can infer that if there is a mechanism underlying this, then that's the best explanation I have, but I'm assuming, I'm making a belief that this is what happens. And the belief is very powerful. It is a very useful tool, but it is a tool. It is not objective knowledge. But then you come to why it matters. And at this point, we end up with right back to the book, right back to the wardrobe, right back to the fundamental problem is that we cannot derive these value judgments from the data. We cannot derive the mechanistic models from the data. They come from outside of the system. Now, this is true no matter who you are. This is true no matter what belief you have, where you come from with your a rampant, I don't know, Labour Party member, Conservative Party member. I'm trying to be as politically neutral as I can at this point in time. The point is the value proposition inevitably, inexorably, logically has to come from outside the system, or it's arbitrary. And it might be a nice social preference. You might enjoy it. It might suit you. You might feel very comfortable with it. But ultimately, it is an arbitrary decision, an arbitrary value judgment. So having come into an understanding of the limits of our knowledge and the tools we need to create knowledge, and not denigrating for a moment the value of that knowledge, let's just think in terms of our faith, if you like, our Christian faith. And in one sense, it's not a complete, exhaustive description of the universe. It is a direction of travel. We have a model which we think, this really is good. For example, let's think about ultimate reality. God as a triune, dynamic fellowship of love, with relationship at love at the heart of the universe. That is an absolutely fantastic model. No, I can't think of any other world philosophy at all, whether it be theocentric or not, that has anything which is half as good as this. Reality is all about relationship and love. And when we pray, when we worship God, we're joining in this relationship. We're joining in this song. We're joining in this dance. We're joining in the love and the relationship at the very heart of the universe. So what about the immediate world around us? Well, I would like to phrase it as a scientist as the creation project. Now, the trouble with the creation project is sometimes we get a little bit stuck on a very immediate and straightforward understanding of the early chapters of the Bible, where we think of that it all went wrong. And of course, it did go wrong. I wouldn't change that for a minute. But actually, where it went wrong is, if you like, in the context of a bigger picture. And that bigger picture is an ongoing project of kingdom coming, an ongoing project of God organizing his purposes and making his purposes happen as history develops, and as you and I, as agents in this, contribute to it or hinder it. Because we have this heuristic of this creation project being one of increasing heuristic complexity. Because 100 years ago, people wouldn't really have thought very seriously about jet aircraft. Here they are. They wouldn't have thought very seriously about supercomputers. But here they are. They wouldn't have thought very seriously about genomic sequencing. But here it is. And this is all the complexity that has been completely anticipated and designed into the system. And you and I are significant agents in this kingdom. Because what it is basically is a personal, relational, and purposive universe. Then we might like to think of issues of restoration, sin, suffering, and redemption, because this creation project has had a major hiccup. Let's not pretend otherwise. And we would immediately think of justice, joy, well-being, society, the physical environment. But I would like to take your thinking a step further. It also applies to the knowledge environment and the use of these epistemological tools under the direction of travel of our faith to actually support the development of this creation project. So let's move on to understanding data. Now, I suspect many of you will be thinking of data in terms of different types of data. So you've got questionnaires, you've got mobile phone data, you've got brain images, you've got electronic health records. And I must say my examples are going to come largely from the biomedical world, because that's the world in which I live and work and have my being. But there's a deeper question. And the deeper question is the study design. How you collect your data is an important, but it's a technical issue. And there are technical solutions. And we can come on to those in the questions if we have time, and if that is your interest. How you design the data collection fundamentally affects the inferences you can draw from it. So, for example, you might be a strong exponent of qualitative data, and that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's brilliant at generating questions. It's brilliant at generating research questions and hypotheses, but it cannot test them, at least not very rigorously. So if you want an answer, you're not going to get it, actually. you've got a fascinating question, a question which no one else would have thought of, really critical, at least you think it might well be, but how can you test it? Or you might want to go into an ecological survey, like a demography. And you had a talk last week from a very eminent demographer. And this describes populations at a group level. And how many people in the UK smoke, how many people in the UK are below the poverty line, whatever. But it doesn't tell you about the individuals in that population. It tells you about this lump called the UK, or this lump called South Korea, or this lump called Europe, which is fine, but it just doesn't help you understand what the individual is doing. And then you might have what's called a cross-sectional survey, like a smoking survey. And this describes populations at an individual level. So you not only know how many people are smoking, you know who they are and the other things that there are to do with their lives. For example, do they live on the poverty level? Do they take any exercise? The problem with this is the direction of causation. Whether this causes that can only be inferred. Let me give you an example. If you go to a public park and you go to middle-aged men and you say, "Excuse me, Mr. Jones, I'm a bona fide researcher. Have you had a heart attack?" And you show him your identification card so he doesn't get you arrested. And you'll describe, I would just imagine that people in the middle age onward, roughly about 5% have had a heart attack. And you'll say, "Well, Mr. Jones, how stressed do you feel?" And he'll say, "Well, today, 4 out of 10. You go to a coronary care unit and you say, well, Mr. Smith, have you had a heart attack?" "Yes, I have. That's why I'm in here. Can't you see?" "Oh, and how stressed do you feel?" "Oh, 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10. And then you do your correlation, looking at, is stress correlated with heart disease? And you find it is. It's really strongly correlated with heart disease. But the question is, what caused which? Did the stress cause the heart attack? Or did the fact that I'm in a coronary care unit increase my stress? And there's no answer. To get the answer, you need to do what's called a cohort study. So what you show is change in individuals over time, and that shows you whether the change has affected the outcome. So, for example, you go back to the heart disease example. You go to 1,000 men, and I say men because they die of heart attacks more than women. So it's a much more economic study to do. You don't need quite so many individuals. You go to 1,000 men and you say, let me measure your stress levels on it. Oh, okay, 4, 5, 3, 2, or whatever the measure is. Then you come back 5 years later and you say, "Oh, have you had a heart attack?" And you find that actually, by and large, a higher proportion of men with higher stress have had a heart attack. Now, obviously, the heart attack 5 years later did not affect the stress levels 5 years earlier, not unless you're a time lord. Okay. So you have the causality built into the system, and it works beautifully. The problem is it's a long-term investment. It takes 5 years for you to get your answer. Oh. So then you want to know, can I do something about it? I'm using smoking cessation there, but we could just follow on the heart disease metaphor for a moment. I think if I do a stress reduction intervention, will that affect people with subsequent heart attacks? So you get 1,000 people, they've all had heart attacks, they're all very keen to help, and you say, "I'm going to give you a random half an intervention, and the other half are just going to be put on good, sound, solid dietary advice." And then you go back to me in 5 years. Okay, who's had a second heart attack? Now, if you find that your intervention group has a lower risk, that is really good evidence for causation. What you're saying is, it's not just I think this is causing it. I'm really confident this is causing it. Okay, so different standards of evidence. And it's study design, which is the critical thing, not the data collection modality. So let's understand data again in terms of the development of 4 ideas. And this is moving from the qualitative to the quantitative. The first idea is that human disease is related to the environment, Hippocrates, 600 BC. The second idea is that if you quantify, measure observations, they may be instructive, 1662. In 1837, it was demonstrated that natural experiments can show causation, and that experiments can be conducted to show causation, and that's 1907. We might say, well, John, what's the big deal about causation? Well, the big deal is simply this, and we may differ on this, but if something happens, that's okay, I'm interested. But what I really want to know is why it happens, because then I can do something about it should I wish to. So that's why the causation is a big deal here. So let's look at the environment. Hippocrates, he wrote 600 years BC, whoever wishes to investigate medicine properly should proceed thus. In the first place, to consider the seasons of the year and what effects each produces, then the winds, the hot and the cold, especially such as are common to all countries, and then such as are peculiar to each locality. But note, he said, consider, not count. All right. So Hippocrates would be there for the rest of his life considering. And it might be very entertaining. I'm not knocking it, okay? I'm not knocking it. But if you wanted to know why or what, he'd need to count. So let's look at quantification. This is John Graunt. He was one of the original members of the Royal Society. He was a merchant by trade, but he quite enjoyed numbers. I suppose merchants do enjoy numbers. And so he decided he'd do some sums. He compared the bills of mortality, which is the equivalent of the death certificate, between London and a town in Hampshire. And he noticed that actually more males were born than females. Isn't that interesting? Ladies, is this a good idea? Well, it gives you more choice, so it can't be that bad an idea. He discovered that the men die sooner than the women die. I'm not sure I really like this study. I've been very pressured by this study, but there we are. He discovered that infant mortality was very high. That the plague mortality was higher in the city than in the country, and that the seasonal mortality was higher in the winter than the summer. Now, without counting, you would never know most of those things. You could have a guess, you could consider, but you would never know. He then constructed the first life table. So what we have here is age, deaths, and survivors. All right, this is going to, this has different animations on than I was expecting. So at age 0, by definition, no deaths, and therefore 100% survivors. Yes, so far so good. Okay, oh good, let me just go down. I'd like you to guess what the death rate would be at 6 years of age.
50%?
50%. Any other offers on 50%?
20%.
20%. Okay, you can see who the optimists and the pessimists are in the group. But the point is, you don't know. Okay. Let's do it again because of the animations.
Wow.
36%.
I win the car.
Okay, so if you get when you're born, the odds about getting to 6 are not that high. Okay. So we could then go down, couldn't we? Do this again. Okay. Very few people got to 80. Very few people. Virtually nobody who got to 80.
Wow.
So with the numbers, there is, if you like, something that motivates you to do something about it. Numbers really do count. Let's look at natural experiments. Now, this is a great one, I have to say. This is about organizing existing cholera data. Now, John Snow was a physician to Queen Victoria, and London, particularly because it's around the Thames, had frequent cholera epidemics. And what John Snow did was to organize the information. So he had, for each water company, because they were private water companies, for each water company, he enumerated the number of houses supplied versus the cholera deaths, and then he calculated the cholera deaths per 10,000 houses. So there was the Southwark and Vauxhall, a water company. It supplied 40,000 houses. There were 1,200 deaths, 315 deaths per 10,000 houses. The Lambeth Water Company was only a much smaller water company, and it had a smaller number of deaths.
Wow.
But actually, the death rate was much, much smaller. Okay. Now, you might think that the Lambeth Water Company was an outlier. So if you look at the rest of London, you discover that actually it's the Southwark and Vauxhall which is the outlier. So I know that this is an unfair question, but let me ask you, where don't you want to live? Absolutely. Who wants there? So what he then did was go to the Southwark and Vauxhall Water Company to check out what was going on. And he discovered that their in-pipe was just a few meters downstream from their outpipe. So effectively, this company, quite innocently in some ways, right, were just circulating refuse around their water company. You know, it was absolutely gross. But the point is, without knowing that cholera was a germ, all right, you've got the source of the problem. And now London does no longer have any cholera epidemics. And when there are cholera epidemics elsewhere, we know exactly what's going on and exactly how to stop it. Okay, this is an interesting one for me, because when I was a boy, about age 2 or 3, we lived in London, and it was after this, I hasten to add, and a smog would occasionally descend. And as a 3-year-old, it was so exciting because you could open the door and you couldn't see anything. And you could wander out and get lost, you know, and you couldn't see your front door, you know. And I remember my mum not letting me go out, and I thought she was really mean, really mean. When I look at the numbers, I see that she was doing me a big favor, because what you see is as the various different air indicators, sulfur dioxide, smoke, and temperature change, there's a bit of a lag, but mortality increases. And as it goes away, there's a bit of a lag, but the mortality decreases. It's very hard to say that the smog did not affect the mortality. So what you've not done is spend stacks and stacks of money designing a complicated experiment. All you've done is organized your numbers in order to draw fairly good causal conclusions. So this is one of the very first trials. And so this is all about Berry. Fletcher, who was the superintendent of the Kuala Lumpur Lunatic Asylum at the time, he noticed that a large number of his patients, his clients, were ill and dying of beriberi. And he was a bit suspicious. It was something to do with the food. So he organized, by the way, these animations were done by my children when they were much younger, I have to say. He organized a trial. So this is the Kuala Lumpur Lunatic Asylum. It has a central courtyard and 2 wards either side. And he lined up all the people, all his clients, and he just went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right to the end. And he put all the odd numbers in one ward and all the even numbers in another ward. And he controlled the diet. And in one ward, he gave, in the even numbers ward, he gave the clients cured rice. Now, cured rice is rice which is boiled in the husk, okay? And then in the other ward, he gave uncured rice. And this is rice which is milled to remove the husk before it's boiled, okay? So that's the only difference. Apart from that, they had the same food, same weather, you know, etc., etc., etc. So what was the outcome? Well, after 1 year, there were 2 cases of beriberi in the cured rice group and 34 in the uncured rice group. No deaths in the cured rice group and 18 deaths in the uncured rice group. 10 patients with beriberi were transferred to the cured rice group and all recovered. Which would you prefer to have? Absolutely. Now the point is that when you cure rice, vitamin B goes from the husk into the kernel. And beriberi is a vitamin deficiency. Simple, isn't it? It's so simple, so elegant. But the way you design this simple experiment allowed you to make very strong conclusions. Okay, this is an amusing one. In the 18th century, the British were constantly at war with France. And the British maritime authorities, the Admiralty, were really annoyed because more of their sailors were dying of scurvy than from French cannon fire. And this really is unacceptable, you know, really unacceptable. And they said to this chaplain, look, find out what's going on, would you? And so he took 12 scurvy patients and put them on a beaten up old ship in a river somewhere. And they all had the same basic diet and living conditions, but 2 of them were given, in addition, a quart of cider per day. 2 were given an elixir of vitriol 3 times a day, which is some sort of acid-based medicine. 2 were given vinegar 3 times a day. 2 were given half pint of seawater per day. 2 were given an electuary, which is just some made-up, disgusting medicine. And 2 were given 2 oranges and 1 lemon per day. Okay. What happened? Whoops, no, it doesn't tell you that. Wait a minute, let me just go back. What happened is that the 2 sailors that were given citrus fruit recovered and nursed the other 10. Okay. Now, here's the funny thing. Lind did not believe his own data. It took 40 years before the Admiralty insisted that British sailors be given citrus fruit as part of their staple diet. And of course, the cheapest form of citrus fruit was limes, which is why British sailors were called limeys. Just small. Now your education is complete. We can go on. Okay, let's look at something a bit more serious now. Mortality from smoking. What we have here is the risk between, if you like, if we look at the first top line, pulmonary TB. In the non-smokers, we have 4 cases per 100,000. In the people who smoke 25 cigarettes plus per day, we have 20 cases per 100,000. So there is a relative risk of 5. Does that make sense? People understand that? Good, good. For obstructive lung disease, the relative risk is 22. So you're 22 more times to have more likely to have obstructive lung disease if you are a heavy smoker. If we go down to all vascular diseases, it's twice as your relative risk is twice as great. But notice that then the absolute numbers are substantially greater. So though the relative risk is greater, the absolute number of deaths is an order of magnitude larger than for the other causes. If we look at cancers, upper respiratory sites, you are 48 more times likely to have an upper respiratory site cancer if you're a heavy smoker than if you're a non-smoker. 25 for lung cancer, 11 for esophageal cancer. All cancers together, 3 times. All-cause mortality, because this is affected by the vascular deaths on the previous slide, you are twice as likely to die early if you are a smoker, heavy smoker, than if you are a non-smoker. Again, the power of numbers, it is incredible. Okay, this is the doctor's study I was referring to in an earlier slide in terms of Richard Dole study. Here we have survival curves. So this is what proportion of your group are surviving at different age groups. And we discover that if you look at the non-smokers, the red line, that's the survival curve. Then if you look for smokers, the blue line, and effectively on average, there is a 10-year difference in survival due to smoking. I mean, you might think, oh, that's interesting. What I find really interesting is this one, that if you stop smoking at age 35, your survival curve almost fully recovers and travels back to the non-smokers.
Wow.
Isn't that a fantastic public health message? Just stop. You know, I know it's easier said than done, but now is the time to stop. If you leave it until you're 45, then you do get some improvement, but it's halfway between smokers and non-smokers. So that study took 10, 20 years to do, but the findings are good, you know. Those findings have affected behavior throughout the world. Let's look at lung function. So this is a picture of our lung function, everybody's lung function. We're born, well, when we're in the womb, we don't really have much lung function. Then it grows rapidly to about 20, and then it begins to tail off. You know, I do not have the puff I used to have. Not that I would admit that to my children, but they know. They know. But for some reason, whether it be poverty or whatever, sometimes our lung function is diminished. And what that means is, although it goes up during the same period, it doesn't quite reach the same peak. And because it hasn't reached the same peak, it falls off. But it falls off at the same rate that it would have otherwise. The difference in slope is negligible. So then you can see at what proportion of, at what level do we have symptoms? Well, it's roughly 20%, not percent, but whatever that unit is, of our lung function. So above that line, we have redundant capacity. We don't know how good or bad we are because we don't need to. But below that line, all of a sudden, we start huffing and puffing, we find it difficult to breathe. But there becomes a point at which death occurs. And it's just a fact of life. Now, this is somebody who's damaging their lungs through smoking. Okay, they get to the same peak, but actually the fall off is substantial. And even if they stop smoking, the slope may even out again, but it doesn't go back up to where it was. The rate of change is the same. So here we have the determinants of gain, which means we can look closely over those first few years to work out why some people have better lung function than others. And then it shows us the determinants of loss. And that's the period where we look at to work out why some people lose lung function more quickly than others. And so it helps us to structure our understanding of how things operate and what are likely causes and effects. Okay, let's look at scale. We've shown that numbers are important. Let's look at scale. Here we have 5,000 people, and we're looking at the relationship between blood pressure and heart disease risk according to age. Now, what we have here is a series of points and the confidence with which we have that these points are where we think they are. Okay, it's not very easy to interpret. I wouldn't want to put my mortgage on that. We increase it to 50,000 people. We discover that, okay, maybe there's a J-shaped curve there. That there's an optimum blood pressure of about 140, which has the lowest risk. If I increase this number to 500,000, then we have a definitive result.
Wow.
You do not have to do that study again. Okay, so precision, scale matters. To design studies which are large to address very specific questions, they're not necessarily cheap, but the point is you don't have to do them again. I think that is wonderful. Okay, so So I am the director of the Dementias Platform UK, and part of our mission is to make data accessible to third parties. So as if you have a bona fide academic email address, you can log on and get an account, and we will help you identify data. We will help you get permission to access the data, and we will provide you with an analysis environment in which you can play with the data. And for most data sets, it's cost-free, okay? And we have data, not all of the data is cost-free, but effectively we have data on about 3.5 million individuals, biomedical data, but it has demographic data as well. And for those, I think for roughly 2.5 million, the data are free to access. So the opportunity to go into these numbers and to play with them is substantial. And the sort of data we have is that we get very complex data. We have, I don't want to be too boring here, but we have survey data, people answering questionnaires, we have brain imaging data, we have genetic data, metabolomic data, disease outcomes data, and for people who are into devices, whether they be smartphones or accelerometers or whatever, we have core digital data. And we can bring these data all into one secure environment for people to use. All right, so it's like, you know, the world is your oyster. The world is your oyster. And each month we have to send to our funders, which is the Medical Research Council, a report. And we've discovered that by doing automated reporting, where they know the template, they see each month it comes up, that means they have confidence in our reporting. But actually, by and large, they leave us alone to get on with what we're doing. I mean, we touch base, of course we do on a regular basis, but nevertheless, we have transparent reporting to instill confidence in our users and in our funders. And over about 5 years, we've had 835 data access requests from 27 countries. And the beauty of this, you can see the countries there on the map. And the beauty of this is that whether you are in Manchester or Malawi, you can have the same data access. You don't have to be living in Oxford. You don't have to be living in Yale or some fantastically, wonderful university. As long as you've got a connection, all the hardware and the software we run, and it's free at point of use. So this is really a big effort in trying to bring equity, global equity, to science. If you've got a good idea, you can test it. That's what it boils down to. So what? And this is my last slide. Do you know, so what is a really legitimate question to ask? And I'm very happy to be pressed on this. We've had quite a trip, really. We've gone through philosophical basis of knowledge. We've gone through how that fits into our faith. We looked at study designs. We looked at examples of how those designs are worked through and the very interesting information and important information they deliver. So the question is, what questions do you really want to ask? And actually, this is a very hard question. Thinking up really good ideas is not easy. But from our point of view, within a Christian context, is what are the questions that you want to ask that affirm and support the creation project? That doesn't necessarily mean affirm and support your ideas or your preconceived ideas or the ideas that you've inherited or whatever. But nevertheless, what is the innovation? What are the new ways of thinking? What are the new questions that you would like to ask? And why are they important? What uncertainty will they address? And what specific benefits will they bring? And to me, the game changer is in this last question. What study designs do they require? Now, for some questions, the qualitative approach will be absolutely the best one to do, okay? But for other questions, you'll be wanting to look at these other designs. And why I think it's a game changer is because at some point, the travel has to be from secondary use of existing data to the collection of purpose-specific data. And I think that OCMS and other organizations like them are at that point now. This is the point of change. This is the point of challenge. And so my challenge to you is, how would you move, not just into exploring the big world of big data, which I hope you've realized is out there, but actually, how will you move to shaping that big world of big data?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and unless you need the slides up again for anyone, if they do, then we can bring it back up.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. And again, for everyone out there, go ahead and raise your hand if you want to write a question, and Guichun, I'll name it, but you click on.
Yeah.
Let me start off with a question. Yeah, and let's say, okay, all right, you know, one of the things is in terms of numbers, all right, and numbers are really key, it seems, to the kind of work you're doing. What about other aspects? Okay, so let me give you an example of an issue that just came up recently. We were looking at continents where there has been tremendous swings in the numbers of believers, and we can do all kinds of research to study those kinds of things. But one of the things that is a little bit more tricky is in terms of what do those numbers mean in terms of the transformational aspects of the gospel in those lands. So, for instance, we've seen tremendous shift in numbers in the DRC, within Ethiopia and other things. But on the other hand, then we have all kinds of things like ongoing wars between Christians and Christians that are killing each other and those kinds of things. And let's say we wanted to find out if there were like certain kinds of teachings or things that were going on in terms of the missiology that were going on there, that we would triangulate against numbers. Is that something that we could have a data bank to measure, or does that take a little bit of both looking at numbers and analysis and then what was taught? Well, you know, these are the kind of questions we ask around here, and I can see the real benefit of numbers, of looking at that and seeing the numbers. But then what are some of those extra dimensions? How do we bring that in?
So I think that you can design studies to give you very good answers to those questions.
No.
But you can't do it in 6 weeks because suddenly there's a crisis blown up. So on the one hand, this is a design question. What sort of study could you design that would give you those sorts of answers? Right. And the best study, frankly, is a cohort study, where you're looking at how things change in a country. You've measured how things change, and then how the outputs change. Okay. So that's really a straightforward answer. Yeah. Now, the real question, though, is an infrastructure one, because how do you design the infrastructure so that you're collecting these data ready for when something like this happens? Okay. So what you're looking at is I've got to do a study. Yeah. It's actually, I'm anticipating these questions. I'm now going to have this massive, and I do mean massive, global cohort, which has a core data set, minimum set of measures, but nevertheless, measures that you can dip into, i.e., let's say you think there's a crisis brewing somewhere, well, I can ask some more specific questions of the people in that area. Yeah. And you do it technologically, mobile phones, a wonderful data collection tool. So you set up the infrastructure, and at that point, in virtual real time, you are measuring what's happening in these areas, and you get some much more precise answers.
Good. Well, thank you, John. Any questions out there? Because I can always come up with more. Okay, let me ask you. Go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, it was a very, very interesting lecture. I have sat into lectures because I'm not used to understanding everything that happens in a lecture, because they're very difficult to understand. But this was one of the lectures that caught my attention all throughout.
Thank you.
And it's a numbers, and Hewan knows I never wanted to be numbers. So I chose some other study. But so it's very, very interesting what you presented. However, when you said, okay, this is my last slide, I said, oh, it better be good. Remember you said you have 3 slides.
Yeah.
I said, oh, this is your
Yeah,
last
yeah,
slide.
yeah.
It better be good. So the question arose from your last slide then, of course, which was definitely very good. Creation project. And my question is, scientists, we're not talking about some lay people or some atheists or whatever, or religious people. We're talking about scientists who have data, who know what they're looking at the creation project out there. Why is it so difficult for them to realize they know that these complex things can't be, from a big bang. They can't be just by chance. There has to be some design. Why is there no acceptance of God?
Well, whether there's no acceptance of God or public admission of God, I wouldn't like to hazard a guess.
Right.
But one of the reasons I started with the philosophy was because many scientists think that their discipline is objective and they can't see God. Okay,
Right.
and I'm gently trying to point out that actually for none of us is it wholly objective. The observations might be,
Right.
but the belief system isn't, and the value proposition isn't. And that's a real challenge to many scientists who've just never thought about it. And I'm not saying it's their fault they haven't thought about it, because this isn't discussed in school. What is science in science lessons? Well, you put this in a test tube and it blows up. And it's fantastic fun, but the deeper philosophy of what's really going on is just never discussed. But when I raise it, and I do from time to time with my colleagues, as it's appropriate and enjoyable, I raise it. They concede the point.
Right.
Yeah, John, thank you for coming. Questions like, how do you know if something increases your faith, right? How do you measure that? We're talking about spiritual formation and discipleship and so on. And this is one of the questions that we ask around here, right? So something like that, how would you design a research study?
I think that depends on what you mean by increase your faith, because that's the measurable outcome. And there's a difference between a measurable outcome and, if you like, the mechanism underlying something. So you might have an intervention, but deep down, I'd like to think that everybody on this call, and certainly me, is a fairly thoroughgoing supernaturalist. What we're looking at is, the Holy Spirit. I mean, context is everything, which means the Holy Spirit is everything in terms of context. When it says, that we should listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches, you could add quite legitimately now. And what we're looking at is what interventions, if you like, are vehicles of grace in order to bring greater what? Is it greater knowledge? Actually, I would like to suggest to you it's greater discipleship. I would like to suggest it's the obedience of faith that we're looking to. And I think you just measure that in lifestyle. It's not a questionnaire that says, how obedient have you been this week? You can try it. I wouldn't believe it, if I'm honest with you. Not that I think people are lying. I just think we are a complete mixture of different thoughts and feelings and conflicts. And some people say, "Oh, I've been a terrible saint this year, this week," and everybody else says, "Actually, they're wonderful." And somebody else says, "Well, actually, I'm pretty good." And the rest of the saints say, "Oh, arrogant so-and-so." So I just don't think there's a simple questionnaire answer to this.
So would you say something like this? I mean, it depends on can you quantify it? I guess that's what I'm getting at. Something like abstract concept, can you quantify that in some way? in a observable, measurable way?
You can, but it's always a compromise. Always a compromise.
Okay, let's go with Damon and then we'll go to Chris.
Is there somebody on? Is there somebody?
Oh, well, let's go with Regina first. We'll go to time for the screen.
Regina.
Regina, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation today. I found it to be very, very interesting. And one of the things you hit on was the idea that there are these large depositories of big data, and it makes access to data much easier for individual researchers particularly. But when you're doing a cross-sectional study and you're relying on individuals, it seems it's becoming more and more difficult to find individuals who are willing to participate in surveys and to gather enough surveys to get some kind of picture of what's taking place. And one question I had is, I know some researchers have begun to use incentive-based survey responses, and I just wondered what the ethics, what your opinion was about the ethics of that. Thank you.
Okay, so can I just address the cross-sectional design problem first and then do the ethics problem?
Yes, please.
Okay, so you have to be really clear about the purpose of your data collection. So for example, if I want to know the cause of something, I require a lot of people, but there's no way that I will get a lot of people and a representative sample.
Mm-hmm.
Just not possible. If I want to know the prevalence of something, how big a problem it is in a specific population, then I need a high response rate. And so that is my design problem. The next question is, how do I achieve that design problem? And I think incentives are absolutely fine, provided they're really clear about what they're for. So for example, when I was doing my cutting my teeth in the Medical Research Council's epidemiology unit, it was unthought of that we would pay someone.
Mm-hmm.
But hang on, COVID comes along, and actually they're throwing money at people because the question is so important. So I don't think it's a straightforward ethical issue. I think it's a resource issue and a question of importance, but it's also a design issue. So for example, if I really need to know the answer to one question in a representative sample, it's really easy to ask people one question.
Mm-hmm.
If I then ask them 20 questions, because I just thought I'd take the opportunity, then I'm just reducing the validity of that one question. So you have to make a decision, and these decisions are really important.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and we'll go over here, but Regina's actually working in quantitative things, and yeah, you guys, I don't know if it would be possible for her to maybe ask some questions and guidance in that, but that's up to Regina. But I know she's struggling with getting the space for, and we talked about it at lunch. That's the only reason I mentioned it, Regina, is in terms of that John had some really kind of interesting and innovative ways of getting data in. So anyway, I would just mention that. Go ahead, David.
Happened that I look up the statistics yesterday about the UK population. What's the percentage of the population be Christians? Some website gave me a figure of 50-something%. Yeah. So whatever that means, what's the definition that they use? But the general trend has been that we were told that the Christian population in this country has been coming down. And so the question is, why has the percentage been coming down? And there are all kinds of historical reasons, scientific knowledge, but we don't actually know. I'm just wondering whether we can do any kind of some kind of quantitative study to narrow down the sets of reasons or set them in different orders. This one is the most important reason. This is the second. And so that we have a more concrete grasp of what's actually stopping people from becoming true Christians.
Yeah, no, the problem is, you know, if we'd started our cohort study 100 years ago, we could give a really good answer to that question. Exactly. Now,
No, we get plan for the next 100.
exactly. So the best time to plant a tree is to go. The next best time is tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know, and I think this is exactly the point of this talk, if I'm honest with you. Now, I would just love to stimulate the Christian community to think, okay, how can we seriously collect the data that we need for the next 50 to 100 years?
We need a big data.
Because we can do kinds of qualitative research, interviewing some people, but I feel that we may still remain in the stage of considering.
Exactly, we will, by definition. And there's nothing.
You never really concrete. But which factor is most damaging, and we need to attack that factor. So we're just fumbling, you know, we're not quite sure. So I'm thinking maybe some kind of quantitative research will help us to narrow down some of the major factors and deal with those like diseases. You know,
No, that's why I showed you the disease examples for a reason. And that is they are very worked through and they are very clear in their findings. So what I've demonstrated to you in passing is that we do have the technology, yeah, and it does deliver. Those are the take-home messages. Now, what we do with that, you know, is really up to you guys, I have to say. You know, why don't we just have and I'm not joking now, a complete revolution in how we understand our approach as a missional community to data.
So and the earlier we start this project, the better.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Let's plant the tree tomorrow.
But also the way that we can collect data now using mobile phone, the data can be so much more easily available.
Oh yeah, it has its own challenges because it's much more personally invasive. But those are all things which can be addressed. Absolutely things which can be addressed.
Perhaps we should talk about this.
Yeah, I think so. And that's really one of the things we're really keen on. Let's go with Chris.
John, thank you. I would have loved to have had you here last week for the student lecture because he's trying to measure disciple making movements. And all these questions are part of that. But I'm kind of picking up Heywan's question. The agency I work for, I was a special advisor to the leadership team. And we decided that we wanted to find out exactly that question. How is discipleship going? You know, what does it look like? So we hired Barna. And I started throwing the projections immediately because I understood the way they were structuring the questions was going to get the exact same answer as everybody else. But we went through the data. The leadership team looks at us and go, oh my gosh, we need to do this. And our agency is known for being discipleship oriented. And I watched an entire change come from data that was pre-cooked. I guess my question is, because exactly what Hale was talking about, is how do you inform leaders who are not statisticians, who are very observational, that their data is bad?
Well, you just give them this lecture.
Can we go back in time and I can do that? Because I really needed that.
No, it's, you know, people are very, very well intentioned, right? And I'm not knocking them for a moment. But I have presented this afternoon a series of very sophisticated ideas. There's no two ways about that. But these ideas can be understood because you've understood them. You know, these ideas can be expressed in a way which is aligned and supportive of the creation project. No question they can. But it's a matter of doing it properly and talking to people who know what they're talking about and who are similarly committed to doing it well.
Because if you don't do that, you end up saying, of course, we're not a whole company. We're a drill company.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me ask a question, John, because this is something that has me fascinated. You know, I was most intrigued, and I think this kind of laps over what we were discussing in terms of you've got this data bank you're working, and countries around the world can tap into that. They can load their own data. They can draw down that data.
No, they can't draw it down. this is the beauty of it. You have to do the analysis within our environment.
Okay, so
So we have complete control, and that gives confidence to everyone.
okay, everybody, so you can watch that, but here's the question. It seems that within medical practice, the physiological data that's being collected is pretty standard. Now, how that can apply and how that would relate would be in a million different directions, all right?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure in terms of missional data, we would agree what goes in that pool. And even if the data generated would be misread because they didn't see the questions that generated, etc. So one thing about bodies is, and that knowledge is physiologically, we are similar enough so that we all have hemoglobin, we all have certain sorts of things. And it seems just a little bit more fixed than like we got in the seminar last week, which was raising all kinds of questions, is that their finding is that really fired up prayer meetings, the devotion to the word of God, all these things are what caused the people movements. And you look at it and go, I think you were expecting to find that, and lo and behold, you found it. I'm not sure there's any data we could put in there and everybody go, oh yeah, it was this really active prayer movement, and or whatever. It just seemed to me that it was circular and reinforcing in a good way. I don't doubt any of those things. Yeah, but what kind of a mission data bank, what would be in there? It just seems like it's a different kind of set of data than what you're looking at.
No, absolutely it is. But I would, no disrespect to my wonderful colleagues in the room, but it's your community which hasn't come up with the innovative ideas.
Well, I would push back. I would say I would say there's something about physical sciences that is more amenable to numbers, all right? But the world of ideas is also subject not to just can't be proved, but different forms of proof. So let me give you an example of that, because I'm in a discussion right now about whether, I mean, it's gonna sound a little strange, but whether a certain German thinker has become the deep framework for understanding a major shift in Chinese policy today. I got a pushback from a good one that said, Tom, is it the direct cause, or is it merely a framework by which to explain? That's a very good question that they posed back. I then went and took a lot of time this morning to go through the evidence to argue that it's a framework, all right? Now, I can't look necessarily at numbers. What I can look at is the actual policy of China in Xinjiang, the policy in Hong Kong, and what they're doing in terms of constitutional law and who the figures are. And what I argue is the preponderance of evidence really lends to the idea that there has been a shift in China policy, and that mere justification and illumination really doesn't hold enough to the evidence that we have. Now, none of that deals with numbers.
No, on the contrary, it deals completely with numbers. You've just been measuring a policy. You've been looking at associations. Now, the scale of the numbers might be nominal or even ordinal, but
They're there, yeah.
But they're there.
You
They
can
underline
show
everything.
a relationship. So,
Yeah.
so in the end, I use the term preponderance. It'd be interesting to see how they reply, because I know there's people on the other side going, no, Tom, you misread this or this.
Yeah, but my view on that would be what you want is a lively debate.
Yeah.
Because notice that even in COVID, right, data coming out of every research establishment that could work out how to use a calculator, you still end up having models.
Yeah.
Okay, so science is about models which predict Right? Perhaps I should have made that a bit clearer in the philosophy bit. We are reducing uncertainty, we're not generating certainty.
Right.
And that is a really fundamental thing. So that's why you want transparent and lively debates. And although I really would thoroughly recommend that that there is this massive, global data collection, what I wouldn't recommend is there's only one.
Okay.
There should be several. They should be different. And then when you triangulate the evidence from several using different sampling frames, different measurement technologies, different consent strategies, whatever it might be, and then they all give us very similar answer, at that point, you're more confident.
Yeah, that's really helpful, John. And I think the question for me, and this goes back to you, Damon, I think we need some really hard work on what goes in that data bank. Yeah, absolutely, because otherwise, then it's just garbage and going out in and out. But if it's good, then you can get people, again, doing that analysis under exactly what you described, and that would make this place interesting in a way that we're not right now. So
I think it would make the place sing, actually.
yeah, I think that's excellent.
I really do.
Do I see?
Regina again?
Oh, Regina, please go ahead.
Is the quantity plus.
She's our quant.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, Regina.
The most common state.
There we go. Thank you. Actually, it's just kind of in response to some of the comments that are being raised by you, Tom, is that I think with these big data banks of data that are primarily for the study of natural science. And what we're trying to decide then is, okay, how do we do this for social science? And take the lecture last week, the seminar that was defining movements, the phenomenon of movements. And so they determined the things they wanted to look at and they'd say, yes, if those things are there, then we think there's a movement. And to me, I think that's almost using the data to verify what we already think is happening, instead of looking at the data and deciding if that is happening and comparing it with other regions. Take, for example, if we look at a village and we see this movement phenomenon, and we say, well, it's characterized by great prayer, it's characterized by sharing, obedience, and then we say, okay, those things define a movement. But what we're not doing is collecting the data, just saying, okay, what's going on in this village? What are the participants in Christianity doing in this village? And then collect it from all the villages. And then begin to look at the data between the villages and say, okay, in this village, this is happening. What is different in this village? It's different from this village. And I think in the social sciences, it's because it is conceptual. It is these phenomenon we're studying almost like faith or movement or other characteristics of our discipleship. If we go in there with the idea that we already know what those things are, we're just looking for the data to support it. We've not approached it correctly. And I think it would be not that difficult to start collecting vast amounts of what's taking place in these regions in the world among Christians in those regions, and then putting it into a database and then letting the data tell the story rather than trying to tell the story with the data.
Yeah.
I don't know if that.
That's a good point. Then maybe I could direct that to John, because bounce it off. Isn't the term bias, is it, what do we call it when you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so one of the problems with the questions you ask is the questions can be shaped by the verification process. What steps do you do in your own development of this thing? And questions in your development of your database to ask questions that aren't going to lead to a verification of what you've already assumed.
Yes.
So the trick there is that you are testing a hypothesis. And if the data are poor, then you need better data to test the hypothesis more rigorously. Now, that means you have to have an opinion about where the data are poor and about why they're poor. And I just think it requires a bit of critical intellectual honesty. And I find my colleagues are wonderful. I come up with this fantastic idea and they go, yeah, well, John, you hadn't thought of this, had you? Well, no, I hadn't actually, no. So the sense of intellectual, generous, critical intellectual debate, I think is really important. We're not, if I can just slightly be maybe controversial, but not really meaning to be, we're not here to prove the Apostles' Creed. What we're here to do is to discover how this wonderfully complex world God has made actually works, and I mean it's a societal level, not just as a biomedical level, and from that we can have creative ideas about how to make it work better.
Thank you, John, for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. I have a simple question. And in your lecture, you mentioned several times that numbers have power. And I have a different question. To what extent can we trust in numbers? Because numbers are vulnerable from my viewpoint, and numbers are affected by the power of money. And the donors, they have strings when they give money to you. So I presume that your institution is heavily involved in fundraising with external donors and supporters. So how can you keep your institution independent from the power of money and from the agendas of the donors? And how can you do your research in a trustworthy way in terms of data collection and data interpretation and data analysis?
So the latter part is easy. Nobody wants made up data. Okay, so rigorous and accurate data collection, I just think is taking us right. Now, if I come across a partner, prospective partner, and I have to deal with industry as well as academic partners, who I think is manipulating us for their own ends, we don't accept them as partners. And I've turned down, several. We had one industry partner turned up and we said, this is a fantastic application you'd like us to use. We're really pleased, but we have to know how it works. We can't just trust you. You have to show us the algorithm underlying the application. And they said, no, we can't do that. And then we said, well, no, thank you. And end of story. Whether they offered us £1 million or what, we can't do it.
That's integrity to your cause.
And my job as the director is to ensure that we have a high trust pre-competitive environment. And so if any of our partners aren't quite playing the game, my job is to go and have a cup of coffee with them and to discuss the weather and how that the rules of the game are very important to us. And that's fine. They conform.
Hey, John, piggyback on his point, our industry is the global church. And we sometimes don't have the luxury to just cut them off because they're the one who funding our missionaries. They're the one who funding, like somebody's education, building churches in remote areas and so on. So
well, no, I would take a step back. In the context of this talk, yes, your industry is producing high quality data.
Right.
And if somebody doesn't want to help you with that, you don't want to touch them with a barge pole. Right. Simple as that. They may want to fund your scholarships, PhD, whatever, but for this project, thank you, but no thanks. Right. And if you have a name for integrity, then actually people who value integrity will invest.
Yeah. And they need good data. Lives don't help them.
No, but we collect data from the churches. Like, we have to work with the pastors and all organizations, Christian organizations.
I accept that, and I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I really do think that there is a way to collect data, particularly in a digital age, which does not depend on the bias of gatekeepers. Okay, because what you're doing is saying to someone, let me use your network for recruitment. They say yes or no. But if they say yes, once that recruitment is made, you have consent from the individual, not the gatekeeper. Okay.
Yeah, let me ask a question, because I was once at a center in Toronto, one place, and I came away with kind of negative feeling. I'm not any suggestion what you're suggesting, but what it was is you walk on in, and this was some $1 million project, and up on the board was a map of the Middle East, all right, with little lights that light up. And every one of those lights lit up with someone on their phone who had given their heart to Jesus. I looked at it and I thought, I don't know what that light means. All right.
Yeah.
That without a whole lot of further questions of why did you push that button? What's going on? Is that really another Christian? And part of the problem that we face in missions is if we actually took the numbers that were sort of quantified, but we've evangelized all of Africa several times over, and it didn't happen. So,
but why are we so obsessed with that number? Why aren't we looking at the deeper issues underlying numbers like that?
Right.
You know, that to me betrays a very superficial understanding of the data enterprise.
Right.
You know, I'm just completely unconvinced, so I don't give it the time of day, if I'm honest.
I didn't say anything, but
I'm really.
But it makes us feel good. That's not, this
Well, somebody else is
is
going-
to make us feel good,
yeah.
to make us feel like our dollars have done something.
No, what I would say though, John, what I would say is what I said was, this was someone who was interested in numbers. I wasn't interested in the qualitative side and really wanted something that was quantifiable. But that's not what you're saying, John, but that's what I saw there, and that was a danger point. But I think what you're saying, which is really important, is you gotta have the right questions and you gotta have the right data for it to be able to be effective and really make a good difference in mission and a game changer.
So this is why I think it will be institutions like OCMS that can make the difference. Now, whether you do or not is up to you.
Yeah.
Okay. But you are in prime position to do so.
Yeah.
Because you know you treasure your academic independence. All right. Hopefully, you would treasure your opportunity to innovate and to have global influence, and not in a sense of "aren't we wonderful?" Because that's not the sense I get of this place at all. It's much more in the sense of, you know, we're just servants, and you know,
And what's happening?
This is helpful, and if this helps you to understand how to better use your resources, then that's absolutely fine by us.
That's excellent. And any more questions in the room or elsewhere? Well, let's just put our hands together for a break. And this is recorded and will be on YouTube. So for those of you who want other people to tune into this important lecture, we invite you to do that. And again, just how important this series is in terms of mission and mission studies going forward. And we're just very, very honored and blessed, John, for such an excellent, and sorry for the hard questions, but that's what we're about.
That's what we're about. That's fine.
All right, well, thank you so much. And with that, we will bid adieu until 2 weeks' time. Sadly, next week, we have Rachel McCleary from Harvard University who does quantitative research, but she needed to be with her ill grandfather for Thanksgiving. So we're gonna miss Rachel. I'll get her back later, but it was too late to make a substitution in that. But then in a couple of weeks, we're gonna look at some interesting hard data work going on in Japan and also in the United States that is using good quantitative data for this very thing in terms of careful mission research and getting good data to know what's going on out there. So very good. Well, thank you so much. And with that, we bid adieu. Thank you.
Wow.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
This is why I'm a theologian. So much easier. What did I just say?
No, it's real. And,
Says